Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 1 of the Terror Cellar. Now, this is my first time committing to a podcast, and I'm really excited about it actually. I've had some experience doing my own radio show in the past, so I've got, I'm used to speaking in a microphone and singing in a microphone, but this is the first time I've ever made a podcast, and I'm excited about it. It's something new, and I like to try new things out. So I hope that you're going to enjoy this little journey with me. Can I just introduce myself though? I'm Andy Crofts. I'm known as being a musician and an abstract artist. They're the main things I've done my whole life. But throughout my life, I've always had an obsession with the paranormal, the supernatural, or anything spooky. And it's got to the point where I think I wanted to channel all of that and put it into something cool like a podcast. I listen to them all the time. I've always read the books. I think it stems from my nan. I spent a lot of time with my grandparents as a child. I was an only child, and my mother worked away, so I spent most of my time with my grandparents, and my nan especially always had a bit of an obsession with all things supernatural. There were books on the shelves, Reader's Digest books, about the strange and the mysterious. And I used to read these things religiously, and it just rubbed off on me. And as I grew older, these feelings and fascinations never went away. I've always been interested. So it's got to the point now that I'm going to have a go, and I really hope that you enjoy my show. And if you do enjoy it, I'd be so grateful if you can follow it, like it, or whatever you do, and come along with me on the ride, because it's going to be really fun. My plan is to read out ghost stories, mainly ghost stories, but I'm open to all things. Should it be strange happenings of any kind or UFO experiences, whatever you've got, I want you to send it to me, okay? Because it'd be my pleasure to read it out on the show. So if you do have stories that you would like me to read out and be featured on the show, please send them to theterrorcellarpodcast at gmail.com, and we can go from there. Now, I don't want to speak too much as it's the first episode, so I think it's time to start our first story. This took place in our 3-bedroom home, where only 2 of the rooms were occupied. The third room, a spare bedroom, was mostly used for storage and had been empty for weeks. It was around 3 a.m. on a Saturday morning. The house was completely still and everyone was sound asleep. Suddenly, I was startled awake by the sound of an old musical keyboard. It wasn't just random noise, it played 3 distinct notes, almost like a slow, deliberate tune. At first, I thought it was my son. He had a history of sleepwalking, so I assumed he had wandered into the spare bedroom where we kept the keyboard. I got out of bed, still groggy, and went to check on him. But when I peeked into his room, I found him fast asleep, undisturbed and wrapped up in his blankets. I hesitated for a moment, feeling uneasy, but decided to investigate the spare room anyway. I walked down the hall and gently pushed open the door. The room was dark and silent, just as we had left it. But there was something off about the air in the room. It felt colder, heavier somehow. I stepped in and looked around, expecting to find something, but it was completely empty. No sign of movement, and no one else was in there. I walked slowly to the keyboard, which sat on a stand in the corner of the room. My heart skipped a beat when I realised something chilling. The keyboard wasn't even plugged in. I checked again to make sure. Not only was it unplugged, but there weren't any batteries inside it either. It should have been impossible for it to make any sound, let alone play a few distinct notes. I stood there for a moment, heart beating out of my chest, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but no matter how hard I tried to rationalise it, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. The next day, I didn't think twice. I took the keyboard, marched it straight to the trash and threw it out. I wasn't going to keep something in the house that played music on its own in the dead of the night. Even now, I still think about those notes and wonder who or what was trying to play them. Thank you very much, Margaret Garcia, for sending in that short ghost story. If I heard the three notes like that, I think my heart would be bursting out of my chest as well. I think the spookier thing about it is, why were they trying to play it? What were they, like you said, who was doing it and why? That freaks me out more, because were they doing that in their own world? Were they just playing it, or were they trying to get your attention? That's the thing that fascinates me the most. Who knows? I guess we'll never know, but it's still enough to make you have a slight heart attack. And now for story number 2. This has been sent in by Kerry Warren, and it is set in the year 1984. It was a Friday night, and my best mate Mark and I were driving home after visiting our then girlfriends. As we approached a dip in the road, we saw thick smoke everywhere ahead. A Porsche sped past us, its brake lights flashing as it disappeared into the smoke. When we drove through the smoke ourselves, we looked up to the left and saw a row of 6 houses on a hill. The middle house was ablaze, fire roaring from all 4 windows, totally engulfing the house. We kept driving around the bend, but something didn't sit right. I turned to Mark and said, "We can't just leave. We need to go back." He agreed, so we did a U-turn and returned to the spot. We parked behind the houses and walked right up to the one that had been on fire. But when we got there, nothing. No flames, no smoke, not even a smell. We checked the other houses too. Everything was completely fine. The smoke that had filled the road just moments before was gone. Confused, we drove home, and the next morning I called Mark and asked, "Have you smelt your clothes?" Both of us reeked of smoke, and it was such a strong smell it was unmistakable that it had come from some kind of fire. That Saturday morning, we drove back in daylight to check again, but every house was perfectly intact, and there was no sign of there being any fire anywhere in the area. We still have no explanation for what we saw that day. Thank you to Kerry Warren for sending in that short story. Now it's time for story number 3, and this is actually one of my own, or my own, shall I say, my own encounter I had when I was a teenager, and I'll tell you all about it. My story starts in the early 90s in Northampton. Northampton was my hometown, and I spent most of my childhood growing up with my grandparents while my mother was away working. My grandparents decided to start a new business, as my nan had been a nurse most of her life, and it felt natural for them to start an old people's home. Me being around all the time kind of went along with the ride. The house was very big and very old, Victorian I think. It was set on Park Avenue North in Northampton, which was just by Abington Park. As I became a teenager, I eventually took on work in the old people's home, just enough to have a little pocket money and feel like a grown-up basically. This eventually escalated into me doing night shifts, which I didn't mind doing because I was young and it was easy for me to stay up most of the time, and it was fun. The house had a few floors and many rooms which were all occupied. On the very top floor, which was the attic, I had a bedroom, and next to my room was where my grandparents used to sleep. So I knew the whole layout of the house. I knew what was where and who was in what room at all times. So if anything unusual was to happen, I would know, because I was there so much. I would know if anything was out of the ordinary. One time I was set to do a night shift, and I'd arrive as usual on my bike. I'd park it up and go in the house, and usually sit with my grandparents for a bit before they went to bed. We'd just sit and watch telly, and I'd start by doing a few rounds of the house, just checking on the people, just open the door, make sure they were asleep. And then my grandparents would go to bed, and I would be left on my own downstairs to do the night shift. Sometimes on a night shift, I'd find myself feeling hungry at random times throughout the night. That night in particular, I went into the kitchen around 3 a.m. and was looking for something to eat. The house was quite long, and the kitchen was set kind of in the middle of the house, so nowhere near the front door or the back door, just nice and settled in the middle. To stop flies going in the kitchen, the door used to have them long, multicoloured plastic strips of material that would hang down, kind of like what there'd be at the butcher's, just lots of these plastic things hanging down, and you would have to kind of open them to walk through. That night, whilst cooking food, I was stood by the door in the kitchen. I had my wage packet out, which was a little brown envelope, and I was counting the cash inside. Whilst counting my money, I still had vision of the door and the long strips of plastic hanging down, which were perfectly still. I was counting my money, and all of a sudden, a dark figure rushed past the door, making all of the plastic strips whoosh in a big motion as if a gust of wind had just blown them. I didn't see a face, but I saw a dark figure rush past in a hurry. Usually, if my grandparents were up in the night, they would come down and they would say hello. There was no reason for them not to say hello to me whilst I was doing a night shift. So I found it kind of strange something had rushed past so fast. All the old people in the home walked very slow, so even if I had left 5 minutes later, I still would have caught up with them. I walked out of the kitchen, looked left and right, and slowly walked around the layout of the house. I started at the bottom and slowly made my way up the stairs. Walking up the stairs, I looked around as I normally did. I looked in all of the bedrooms, but everyone was asleep. I carried on up to the top floor, which was my bedroom and my grandparents' bedroom. I popped my head in, but they were both fast asleep. At that point, I realised something strange had happened, and I felt the hairs go up on the back of my neck. I ran down the stairs as fast as I could, missing most of the steps as I jumped. I rushed into the living room, sat down, watching television with my hand held up to the side of my face so that I couldn't see the doorway which led to the hall where the dark figure had rushed past. I spent the whole night scared as hell, thinking about what I saw and what it could have been doing. Where was it going and why? Many people had died in that house, so I guess it wasn't completely unusual for there to be a chance of any kind of spirits. After my night shift, my grandparents would come down in the morning to start a day's work and to see if I was okay. I told my nan everything that had happened that night, but she seemed completely unfazed. She said sometimes there's a little grey lady that would walk down the staircase at night, and if you didn't see her, you would definitely hear her footsteps. After that, my night shifts were never the same again, and I'd spend most of the evenings in fear, praying that the morning would come as soon as possible. I didn't have any more visual sightings at all, but I'd sometimes hear footsteps walk past my door and strange creaks throughout the night. I didn't do the night shift for much longer after that, but it's something that has always haunted my mind, and I often think what would have happened if a face had come back around the door after the dark figure had rushed past. Thank you very much for listening in to episode 1 of The Terror Cellar. I hope you've enjoyed the 3 stories I've brought you today, and if you like what you're hearing so far, it would really help out my podcast if you could subscribe to it, and even better, leave a review of some sort, because it will help my podcast go much further. So anyway, I will see you for the next episode, and don't have nightmares. Bye bye.